And so, snow and ice became part of the family. It was night and someone arrived at the Tang clan manor. Upon seeing who it was, the guards couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised. It was Soryong, Gupi, Lady Huang and Yoa who was in the form of Huang. The guards were somewhat surprised to see two Huangs. Upon observing closely, they realized that Yoa was a spider, and they couldn't understand why this creature had the appearance of Lady Huang. Soryong coughed, and with a confident expression asked the guards to announce to the elders of the clan that the proud official son-in-law of the Tang clan had arrived. Furthermore, he instructed them to inform that he had captured, then corrected himself and clarified that he had actually brought with him one of the 10 great poisonous creatures. Upon hearing that Soryong had brought one of the 10 great poisonous creatures, the guards could not help but go into shock and decided to report it immediately. They launched a flare to announce that Soryong had returned with one of the 10 great poisonous creatures. Not long after, the patriarch, his wife, the grand patriarch, and the clan elders began running towards Soryong. The great patriarch remembered that Soryong had said he would go look for food for the lizards, questioning with disbelief how, instead of this, he had ended up bringing a spider. The patriarch demanded to know where Soryong had been and what he had been doing. The eyes of the patriarch and his wife widened in surprise and confusion upon seeing that the spider looked just like their daughter. With a pleasant smile, Soryong explained that they had found the spider by chance when passing through the Namgung clan, leaving the patriarch somewhat confused. The elders were somewhat confused. In their entire lives, it was the first time they had heard of someone encountering one of the 10 great poisonous creatures by chance, and they could not understand how a human-faced spider, which was said to be so fierce, could have been captured. They couldn't help but smile. With a proud expression, the Grand Patriarch mentioned that Soryong was always doing incredible things. After clearing his throat, he stated that at least in this way, one could truly be called the son-in-law of the Tang family. The patriarch began to laugh, declaring that Soryong was officially their son-in-law. Huang's mother began to show a smile and mentioned that now the promise between Soryong and Huang had been fulfilled. Soryong's jaw dropped in surprise since he didn't know how she knew about this, while on the other hand, Huang couldn't help but blush. With a smile, the patriarch mentioned that this had no importance. What really mattered was that he was now truly part of the family. With a calm gaze, the great patriarch asked Soryong to go to the river starting the next day and catch a live goose. Our boy became somewhat confused. The great patriarch extended his hand and with a smile questioned whether Soryong didn't know that he had to prepare the goose for the engagement ceremony himself. He added that, although he was not yet old enough to marry immediately, at least they could celebrate the engagement. Soryong's eyes widened in surprise. He didn't know what to say. The patriarch began to show a finger and explained that once this was done, even if one day he stopped liking Huang, he wouldn't be able to run away. Huang became nervous and couldn't help but feel embarrassed. She asked her father to stop talking about the subject. They began to chat among themselves. A smile spread across Soryong's face. He caught everyone's attention, making them turn around. Soryong greeted them with respect, and upon noticing this, a proud smile spread across their faces. Huang couldn't help but clench her fist and feel excited. With a confident smile, Soryong declared that, as a member of the Tang clan of Sichuan and as the official son-in-law of the Tang clan, he hoped to get along well with everyone from now on. Thus, once they arrived at the Tang clan, the first thing Soryong did was assign places where the children could stay. First, Yoa chose as her residence a large tree next to the well within the village of the Tang clan. Because lizards behave similarly to dogs, he didn't want to separate them, and instead of sending them to the garden of poisonous creatures, he allowed them to stay in his room. Once everything was more or less organized, Soryong sat down with them to chat. When our boy asked if they liked this place, the geckos began to show a smile and Yoa nodded her head. Then, he told Yoa that if she was hungry, she could come directly to where he was, asking her if she would know how to get there. She began to show a smile, and then started pointing at the spiderweb with her fingers. Soryong's attention focused on it, making his eyes widen with curiosity. She had spread the spiderweb all over the place. If someone bad came, she would punish them and send out an alert with her web. Huang was somewhat confused, while on the other side, Soryong's eyes widened with joy. Showing a finger, he asked if what she meant was that, in case someone suspicious invaded, he should touch the spiderweb and she would come running. She started clapping. With eyes shining with joy, the geckos began to look at our boy. Soryong understood that they also wanted to say that he shouldn't worry because they were going to protect him. He put his hand over his mouth and couldn't help but cry with joy. He got ready to give them a hug, realizing that they were very trustworthy. He was very happy. Thus, once the new home for the new family members was prepared, the engagement ceremony was held. For this, the elders of the clan gathered and, in a simple ceremony, engagement gifts were given as an oath of marriage. However, there was a small misunderstanding during the preparation of the gifts. While Soryang was waiting in the hall, Huyen appeared carrying the geckos in her arms. Soryang's eyes widened with surprise and confusion. She began to show a confident gaze, and our boy noticed that she wanted the gifts to be the lizards, and he couldn't help but wonder if they weren't just a simple ornament. Our boy's face filled with sweat, realizing that this was a problem. He regretted that it had to be precisely this, and he didn't understand how he was supposed to offer the geckos as an engagement gift. He began to remember Huang. He knew that she had liked the geckos, but he didn't think she would say it directly. With a confident expression, he apologized and explained that this was going to be complicated. She became somewhat confused as she didn't know why. Soryang grabbed her arm, began to look into her eyes, and explained that originally engagement gifts existed to promise eternal love. He clarified that although lizards were pretty, the gifts should be immutable objects, like ice jade, to properly symbolize this promise. Huang couldn't help but blush like a tomato. With a kind smile, Soryang mentioned that both geese, which symbolized 100 years of life together, and oath letters had deep meaning. He continued by explaining that in celebrating the engagement, everything he owned would essentially be hers. Upon hearing this, her eyes widened with love. She turned around and thought that this was true, and decided to follow Soryang's will. Our boy was happy and praised himself. She caught our boy's attention, making him curious. With a confident gaze, she asked our boy to call her Huang from now on instead of Lady Huang. Now that they were engaged, they shouldn't use titles between them. Soryang's face filled with sweat, making him blush like a tomato. While the geckos were playing, with a nervous expression, he nodded his head. The next day, when the sun came out, it was time for the meeting with the patriarch. He asked if Soryang and Huang had rested well. Our boy was somewhat curious, wondering why he had called them and whether it would be to give them some advice. With a serious expression, the patriarch revealed that they had been called because they had something to say about Soryang's great technique. Soryang's attention was fixed on him and his mind filled with confusion. Huang explained to our boy that the great technique consisted of learning the internal art of the Tang clan and accepting the poison. Soryang realized that she was referring to the 10 poisons. With a smile, the great patriarch explained that this time it had been a very good thing for Soryang to bring the spider with a human face, since being the weakest among the 10 great poisonous creatures, it was the best one to accept first. Soryang questioned if he was now going to train the great technique. The patriarch shook his head and mentioned that Soryang had said he would use the 10 great poisonous creatures for the great technique, but he originally had another proposal. Our boy's eyes widened in surprise and confusion. With a serene expression, the patriarch revealed that upon reviewing the poisons Soryang had and those he would bring, he had remembered something the clan had forgotten for a long time. With a smile, he asked if Soryang knew what 5 poisons meant. Soryang's eyes widened with uncertainty, wondering if he was referring to the 5 poisons return technique that he had learned. The patriarch nodded his head. Then, he began to show one finger at a time and named the centipede, the lizard, the scorpion, the snake, and the toad. He explained that these 5 poisons formed the basis of the 5 poisons return technique. With a serious expression, he suggested to Soryang the idea of practicing the divine 5 poisons return technique. Our boy couldn't help but sweat. He didn't know what to say. The patriarch interlaced his hands and explained that in the Tang clan they divided poisonous creatures into 2 main categories, common beasts and spiritual beasts. His eyes began to shine with confidence as he revealed that the common beasts were ordinary poisonous creatures that could be found anywhere. The spiritual beasts, on the other hand, were those that possessed mystical powers, intelligence, or even an internal core. Soryang felt somewhat confused and questioned whether the golden-haired king bee he brought, the fat-tailed geckos Snow and Ice, the blue-spotted centipedes, and the human-faced spider would then be considered spiritual beasts. The patriarch nodded his head. It was precisely because of this that he was going to propose something else. The great patriarch began to laugh and made it clear that the 5 venoms returning technique was limited in its mastery, as it only absorbed the venom of ordinary poisonous creatures. But its origin technique, the 5 venoms true returning technique, was different. It could absorb the venom of spiritual beasts. He pointed out that with the blue-spotted centipedes and the fat-tailed geckos, he already had 2 of these beasts prepared. If they also managed to obtain the venoms of the snake, scorpion, and spiritual level toad, Then all conditions would be met to master the 5 venoms returning divine art. That was why he suggested training in said divine art. Soryong's eyes widened in surprise. He remembered that fat-tailed geckos were not venomous. The great patriarch began stroking his beard, explaining that he had examined them. They carried a venom that plunged people into a state of extreme cold. The icy air they emitted was their venom, leaving Soryong somewhat surprised. Now our boy had 2 paths open before him. One was to absorb the venom from the blue-spotted centipede and from the fat-tailed gecko in order to aspire to master the 5 venoms returning divine art. The other was to absorb poison from the human-faced spider, one of the 10 great venomous creatures, and begin gathering all 10 poisons necessary for dual-core 10 poisons body. With a curious gaze, Soryong asked if he couldn't simply use the 10 great venomous creatures to complete the 5 poisons body. The patriarch shook his head. The fat-tailed gecko was not among the 10 great venomous creatures. Soryong put his hand under his chin and began to ponder. He understood that if he absorbed poisons from lower-class creatures like blue-spotted centipedes and fat-tailed geckos, it would no longer be possible to complete the 10 poisons body path using only the 10 great venomous creatures. The choice came down to this: absorb what he called children's poison and follow the path of the spiritual beast class 5 poisons body, or collect the 10 great venomous creatures and fully commit to the 10 poisons body path. Huang began observing our boy closely, not knowing what he had in mind. Soryong realized that this was like choosing a skill tree in a game. He remembered well from his past life, when playing RPGs, that the most important thing was always the skill tree. This choice determined whether one became a useless character or a god-level character. The patriarch asked our boy to think it over carefully. He explained that the 5 venoms returning divine art was an incredible martial art, and without truly heavenly luck, not even he would encounter the 10 great venomous creatures, much less tame them. Soryong came out of his thoughts and couldn't help but get nervous, not knowing what to do. He was torn between taking the easy and fast path of the 5 poisons body, or the arduous and punishing path of the 10 poisons body, one that would allow him to reach even greater heights. Our boy started going crazy, falling into a spiral of indecision. A few hours later, Soryong was still thinking about what to do. Huang's attention turned to him, and she couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. She called his attention and mentioned that if it was because of that promise, he didn't have to tie himself to the 10 poisons body. The 5 venoms returning divine art was more than enough, since it was an incredible martial art in its own right. While her eyes were shining with concern, she asked our boy not to rush into a decision out of anxiety. She assured him that, no matter which path he chose, he would still be Soryong. Upon hearing this, Soryong turned around, and while his eyes were shining with sincerity, he was honest and said that even the patriarch had mentioned that the preparation process was the same in both cases and only the final poison changed. He decided to take his time to think it through. A few days later, Soryong was lying in bed. Even though 2 days had passed while the grand technique was being prepared, he still couldn't decide easily. While the geckos were playing, our boy, completely undecided, asked them what they thought he should choose. Just then, Huang opened the door to Soryong's room with a surprised expression. Our boy became somewhat curious and asked what was going on. With her face full of sweat, she revealed that the blue-spotted centipedes were about to shed their skin again. Soryong got out of bed and his eyes widened in surprise. Without wasting any more time, he went to the pavilion where the centipedes were. Upon seeing them, both he and Huang felt tenderness. The creature's skin had become hard as stone. Soryong remembered that they had been growing very fast lately and hadn't thought that the second shedding would begin so soon. With a curious smile, Huang asked if the appearance of the blue-spotted centipedes would change again. With a confident smile, Soryong nodded his head, revealing that this time, blue spots would start to appear on their bodies. Our boy's eyes filled with excitement. Just the idea that they were becoming like their mother made his heart race wildly. Huang began to show a kind smile. She was very eager to see how the centipedes would change. Soryong was sure that they were going to be even cuter than before. Just then, his eyes widened in surprise and his attention focused on them. Suddenly he realized that this was not something to celebrate. What if they didn't manage to finish drying their bodies in time for the day when the grand technique would take place? Soryong put his hands on top of his head and couldn't help but feel worried. He knew that ordinary centipedes took an entire day to dry their bodies, and based on the last molt, this process would definitely take even more time. Huang's attention was fixed on our boy and she couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. Soryong knew that the venom of fat-tailed geckos was special and needed proper preparation before it could be extracted. He had debated between using the venom of the blue-spotted centipedes or Yoa's for the first dose. But if this happened, then he could no longer use the venom of the blue-spotted centipedes. Our boy began to think. He understood that if he tried to forcefully extract the venom now, something would go wrong. However, he also couldn't just sit around waiting for their bodies to harden. He started imagining Yoa, the gecko, and the centipede in a ring, with Yoa raising her fist. It was then when he realized why in hell he had been tormenting himself over these past few days. 2 days later, the grand technique prepared for him was finally carried out. The ritual took place in the Grand Technique Hall, deep within the Hall of 10,000 Poisons of the Tang clan. He had considered postponing it for the sake of the blue-spotted centipedes, but the preparation for the grand technique was so meticulously complex that delaying it simply wasn't an option. The process was elaborate. First, hundreds of decoction cauldrons were used, each to boil different herbs and extract their medicinal essences. Then, these extracts were cooled and gathered into a massive jar. This constituted the first step. Next, into that jar, a precise mixture of various poisons and blood from poisonous beasts was added. Although this might sound simple, working with hundreds of herbs, poisons, and blood, each with its own volatile properties, and managing them all at once in perfect harmony was an extraordinarily difficult undertaking. In addition to this, with the slightest delay, all the medicinal liquid they had worked so hard to prepare would become useless and would have to be completely discarded. Because of this, sitting idly by waiting was not an option either. His mind was already made up. He would accept Yoa's poison, one of the 10 great venomous creatures. Soryang began to observe the liquid closely, realizing that the color was incredibly dark. The great patriarch approached our boy and informed him that they would now begin the grand technique, ordering him to take off his clothes and enter the jar. Soryang came out of his trance and nodded. Soryang took off his clothes, first put his foot into the jar and then began to insert the lower part of his body. His eyes widened in surprise, as for him, this felt strangely familiar, like an herbal bath. While the great patriarch's eyes were shining with joy, with a smile, he mentioned that they were going to add a single drop of Yoa's poison into this herbal decoction to provoke a reaction. Then, they would add the already prepared medicinal compounds so that his body could begin to absorb the poison. The great patriarch began to laugh, revealing that normally the process would be unbearably painful. Luckily, Yoa's poison was of a paralyzing type, so it wouldn't hurt too much. Upon hearing this, Soryang felt somewhat worried and couldn't help but sweat. The patriarch decided to go look for the rest of the necessary ingredients and asked him to wait a moment. After saying this, they left the room, leaving Soryang alone. Not long after, Huyen, who was carrying the geckos in her arms, and Yoa entered the room and greeted our boy with a smile. With a cheerful expression, Huyen revealed that the centipedes were awake, they had shed their skin, now had spots, and their bodies were emitting an intense glow. The centipedes began to play, and Soryang noticed that Nova, Myra, and Grace were now even more adorable. They began to climb onto the jar in which Soryang was submerged. The change was not as drastic as he expected. In fact, their appearance now resembled that of pillow-shaped stuffed animals, which, in a strange way, made them even more adorable. The centipede's attention was fixed on the liquid. Soryang started laughing since he realized that it must be strange for them to see their father inside there. He knew it was dangerous, so he asked them to stay with Huang. With a smile, she began calling the centipedes to come with her. Nova didn't listen and its attention was fixed on the liquid. When it tried to get down from the jar, unintentionally the liquid came into contact with its ear. It began to writhe in pain, and upon seeing this, Soryang's eyes widened with caution. He revealed to Huang that Nova's antenna had touched the medicinal liquid and asked her to wash it with water immediately. Huang's eyes widened in surprise and concern. Without wasting more time, she grabbed Nova. In the process, it opened its mouth and its saliva came out of its mouth and fell into the liquid. Soryang began to observe closely. Nova's saliva caused the liquid to start reacting and began changing color. Huang's eyes filled with fear upon realizing that the poison was seeping into the jar. Soryang clenched his teeth tightly and not long after, he began screaming in agony. Our boy began to scream in agony. With a worried expression, Lady Huang asked Soryang to regain control. The liquid began to burn Soryang's skin, making his face turn red. He did not know this kind of pain. It was as if all his skin were being torn off while his entire body burned. He remembered that he had been told he must not move at all during the grand technique. Even though he desperately wanted to jump out of there, somehow he barely managed to restrain himself. Foam began to come out of our boy's mouth. For him this was too much. Upon seeing this, Yohua and the geckos were in shock. Lady Huang put her hand near her mouth and her eyes filled with worry. She didn't know what to do. The Great Patriarch and the Patriarch returned, and upon seeing what was happening, they went into shock. They started running toward our boy. Huaying turned around and with a sincere expression explained to the Great Patriarch that the centipede had accidentally dropped a bit of venom. Soryong began to collapse while begging to be saved. The Great Patriarch grabbed Soryong, supported one hand under his head trying to calm him down. The Patriarch asked our boy to stay alert, calm his mind, slow his breathing and above all not lose consciousness. Our boy opened his mouth and started to bleed. He could no longer bear the pain. Not long after, he dropped his hand because he no longer had strength. The Patriarch's attention was fixed on him and his mind was filled with surprise. Everyone panicked, not knowing if Soryong was okay. Little by little our boy's eyes began to close. Soryong felt as if he were underwater. Little by little he opened his eyes and his attention focused on Nova, who was asleep. She made contact with Soryong and a strange energy began to emerge from her body and entered Soryong's body. Several hours later, our boy began to open his eyes. Noticing this, Lady Huaying felt relieved and with a surprised expression informed the Great Patriarch that Soryong was regaining consciousness. Once Soryong fully opened his eyes, Huaying couldn't help but cry and feel relieved to see that he was okay. While on the other hand, the grandfather began to show a kind smile. Soryong started touching his head and realized that he was in the same place. With a worried expression, Huaying asked if he was okay. The Great Patriarch explained to our boy that, fortunately, he had guided his internal qi directly through his Baihui point, so he managed to overcome the worst. He informed him that the grand technique had also ended safely and successfully, and that, although it was not Yohua's poison, in the end he had accepted instead the centipede's poison. Soryong put his hand on top of his head and let out a sigh, realizing that, after all, Nova wanted her father to learn the 5 poisons body. With a worried gaze, he asked if Nova was okay, since he remembered that Nova's antenna had been exposed to the substance. Huaying and the Great Patriarch were somewhat surprised. She explained that she had washed Nova's antenna immediately. She did it anxiously, not knowing whether Soryong would live or die. Soryong's attention was fixed on her and his eyes widened with concern. She turned her gaze to the side, as she was angry. Our boy panicked, knowing that right after the engagement ceremony, he should have gone to see Huaying, his fiancée. But instead, he had instinctively run first toward the centipedes. Soryong's head started hurting again. Noticing this, Huaying asked if the pain was returning. Our boy's eyes began to shine with seriousness since the most important thing for him was to know if Nova was okay. The Great Patriarch and Huaying were in shock as they couldn't believe that he was more worried about Nova than about his own well-being. She noticed that our boy had not yet fully regained consciousness. The Great Patriarch decided to call the physicians. Our boy let out a sigh of relief, since his movement had been swift. 2 days later, the grand technique finally came to an end, once all the medicine in the jar had dried up. Soryong met with the Great Patriarch, who asked our boy if he was really okay, suggesting that maybe they should examine him a bit more thoroughly. Soryong promised that he was fine. With a serene gaze, the Great Patriarch mentioned that, in any case, whether he wished it or not, he had now begun the path of the 5 venoms returning divine art, so he would hand him the corresponding martial arts manual. Soryong remained listening in silence and his eyes filled with surprise. The Great Patriarch revealed that there were 5 martial techniques in total: Centipede's Poison Fang Claw, Venomous Snake's Life-Grabbing Hand, Scorpion Tail Rapid Leg, Lizard Wall Climbing Body Step and Toad's Explosive Palm. He began to stroke his beard and explained that each of the techniques belonged to a specific category: claw technique, hand technique, leg technique, step technique, body technique, and palm technique. This martial art allowed one to reach a realm where one became poison, and poison became oneself, achieving a true unity between being and poison. Soryong's eyes widened with excitement and joy. Seeing our boy's expression, the Great Patriarch realized that he liked it. Soryong nodded his head, although he admitted to being surprised. They were not poison arts or assassination techniques as he had expected. The Great Patriarch coughed. According to him, Soryong had been perceptive in noticing it, since the truth was that this martial art did not originally come from his Tang clan. He closed his eyes and revealed that the 5 venoms returning divine art, and these 5 poison techniques were the martial arts of the 5 poison sect, which had already been annihilated. 200 years ago, the second son of the Tang family, a genius of his time, and the daughter of the palace lord of the southern barbarian beast palace fell in love. Despite fierce opposition from both clans, they eloped and founded the Five Poison Sect. They created a new martial art by combining the strengths of poison arts from the Tang clan with beast fist techniques from the Beast Palace. However, they selfishly took martial arts that should never have left their sect and even mixed them. Naturally, they could not escape persecution from both clans and, about 100 years ago, were finally annihilated in the jungles of Yunnan by both forces. Showing one finger, the Great Patriarch mentioned that after this, it was agreed that both sides would reclaim their respective martial techniques, and what was recovered then was the 5 venoms returning divine art and the 5 poison techniques. His eyes began to shine with tranquility as he explained that, since the essence of both clans' martial arts was intertwined, there was much dispute over its ownership. But since it was necessary to accept the poison in order to master it, in the end it was passed down to his Tang clan. It was said that the sect master of the 5 Poison Sect at that time had been able to withstand the joint assault of both the Beast Palace and his Tang clan, so without a doubt, it was an extraordinary martial art. He had thought that it would be the perfect style for someone like him who had an affinity for poisons. Soryong was somewhat surprised to realize that the Great Patriarch had had this in mind all along. Our boy thanked him and promised to train diligently. The Great Patriarch was happy, since as long as he continued with this dedication, he was destined to achieve greatness. And so, Soryong took his first step in the 5 venoms returning divine art. Soryong left the poison hall and began to stretch his arms, wondering how long it had been since the last time he saw sunlight. Only now did he feel truly alive again. At that moment, one of the little centipedes started running toward our boy. His attention fixed on it and his eyes widened in surprise. It was Nova. She couldn't help but cry with joy upon seeing that he was all right. Soryong realized that she had been waiting for him there all this time. He began to show his bicep and a smile. He knew that she must have had a hard time emotionally. He assured her that she shouldn't be heartbroken, since this hadn't been her fault, and, to prove it, he showed her that Dad was already fine. Nova jumped in and got inside our boy's clothes and started playing. He thought that maybe she felt a little prickly because not much time had passed since she molted. He really would prefer her to climb on his clothes instead of on his bare skin. She began to observe our boy closely, and upon noticing this, Soryong couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised. She came out of Soryong's clothes and started running along his arm. Our boy's eyes widened in fear, wondering if Nova had just understood what he was thinking. According to him, this couldn't be. It must be just a coincidence. He told himself that these kinds of things sometimes happened when you raised a pet for a while. Soryong began to ponder, realizing that he was a hopeless fool. There was no way that Nova, a simple poison creature, could really do this. Nova's eyes began to shine with rage. She was furious with Soryong. Our boy panicked, not knowing what was happening. His eyes filled with surprise. He said nothing and in his thoughts asked her to get on top of his head. Nova obeyed and got on. Then Soryong hid behind a tree and asked her to try to find him. She did it without much difficulty. Soryong panicked, since this had not happened just once, but 3 times in a row. Nova let out a sigh and began to show a confident expression. It was as if her heart and Soryong's were connected by a strange energy. Soryong was in shock, not knowing what was happening. While the 2 centipedes were playing, Lady Huaying, who was somewhat worried about Nova, began to look for her, not knowing where she was. She approached the centipedes and asked them if they knew where Nova had gone, explaining that since she shed her skin, she had been wandering so much that it was hard to find her. Soryong, who was panting and carrying Nova on his back, began to run toward Huaying. His eyes were full of surprise. Our boy put his hands on his knees to catch his breath. Huaying asked if Soryong was okay, but immediately afterwards scolded Nova. She reminded her that she had told her not to go far because of the worry it caused her and insisted that she must inform her mother before going anywhere. With a surprised gaze, Soryong began to show Nova, revealing that this was not what mattered at the moment, but rather the fact that Nova understood human speech. Huaying's eyes were full of calmness, as she remembered that Nova had always understood human speech. This was nothing new. Soryong couldn't help but sweat and feel somewhat confused. He panicked and explained that she understood him even when he was only thinking to himself, leaving Huaying somewhat surprised. Carrying Nova on his back, Soryong decided to go see the Great Patriarch to find out what was going on. With a worried gaze, Huaying suggested they go together. It was daytime and, several minutes later, they arrived at the Patriarch Hall. Our boy left Nova on the table and asked them to please take a look. He explained that Nova understood him just as well even when he only spoke in his mind. Considering that the other children couldn't do this, he proposed that perhaps it was due to the influence of the grand art. The great patriarch began to stroke his beard and his attention was fixed on her. With a serious expression, he explained that this was not the case. He pointed out that in the history of the Tang clan, more than a few people had accepted the poison of spiritual creatures. If supernatural abilities like this had been discovered, there should be records, but he had never seen or heard of them. Soryong's eyes widened with curiosity. With a serene expression, Hwaying questioned what could be the cause. The great patriarch began to think. He concluded that this was undoubtedly due to the 5 venoms returning divine art. The patriarch interrupted his thoughts and confirmed that the grand art was created to absorb poison, and Soryong was the only one who had absorbed the poison of spiritual creatures using the 5 venoms returning divine art. The great patriarch came out of his trance and couldn't help but smile. He knew that the reason this was happening could be the influence of the southern barbarian beast palace, since they treated beasts as if they were their own limbs. Their secret, he concluded, could be embedded in the 5 venoms returning divine art. The patriarch began to stroke his beard. According to him, it would be impossible to find out why this was happening. Soryong's eyes filled with confusion. He didn't know why. The great patriarch explained that there was no reason for them to reveal their most precious secret. He added that if they found out they had mastered a martial art affected by that influence, it would be impossible to predict how they would react. Hwaying felt somewhat worried, not knowing if there was any way to avoid this. The great patriarch closed his eyes and began to think, coming to the conclusion that it would not be easy, unless they owed them a great favor. A while later, Soryong came out of the patriarch hall. He was depressed since this was somewhat disappointing. He began to imagine himself with his pets. He had the hope of gathering Nova, Myra, Grace, Snow, Ice, golden-haired queen bees and Yohua to form something similar to the Bremen town musicians. While our boy was distracted, someone caught his attention, making him curious. When he turned around, he saw Commander Gupe, who greeted Soryong with a smile and expressed his joy at seeing that he was feeling better. Gupai started touching his head. According to him, it was lucky to have run into him there. He explained that there was a slight problem with the venomous creature garden and asked if he would like to accompany him. Soryong couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised to see that there was a problem. Soryong began to ponder. He decided that he should take care of the problem in the venomous creature garden first and then think about the southern barbarian beast palace. He realized that he had completely forgotten about the garden, since he had gone directly to the engagement ceremony as soon as he returned. His eyes began to shine with joy and with a smile he decided to go together. Behind Gupai there was someone. He also wanted to entrust that person to Soryong. Soryong's eyes widened with curiosity. Behind Gupai was Yingying, who with a smile started running toward our boy to give him a hug. Soryong grabbed little Yingying's hand and they started walking with Gupai following them from behind. Our boy decided to take Yingying to the venomous creature garden, as she clung to him and wouldn't let go. He turned around and asked why Yingying was here. Gupai began to show a smile, explaining that she was there for treatment and would stay in the Tang clan for a while, since it was a request from Patriarch Peng. While little Yingying's eyes were shining with joy, with a smile, she asked her older brother why he hadn't come to see her if he had already been back for several days, explaining that this was exactly why she had been waiting for him today. Soryong felt somewhat surprised to notice that she had lost her front teeth in the meantime. Our boy began to show a forced smile and apologized to Yingying. He explained that he thought she had already gone back and asked her if she had gotten very bored being alone. She began to show a bag, making it clear that she hadn't been bored since she had been playing with Clicky. Soryong opened the bag and his eyes widened with curiosity. Gupai also came closer to see what the bag contained. The bag contained a spring beetle. The spring beetle, known in the West as click beetle, was characterized by its ability to produce a clicking sound when flipped onto its back. It was a pest that bored into potatoes and sweet potatoes and destroyed plant roots, but for children it turned out to be a familiar and adorable insect. Gupai felt somewhat confused, not knowing if it was a snapping beetle. Yingying made it clear that it was Clicky, not a snapping beetle. Soryong began to remember his childhood. As a young boy, he called these insects click bugs. This was the first insect he raised in his past life. He could consider it an introductory insect, the one that had led him to where he was today. He sat in front of her and with a smile realized that Yingying liked bugs. She nodded, affirming that she did like them, and she also liked Queen Bee and Clicky. Soryong's eyes began to shine with excitement, as she seemed like a small version of himself when he was young, and he wondered if he should give her some kind of training with poisonous creatures. He picked up Ying Ying in his arms and with a smile asked her if she would like to learn about insects with her older brother, assuring her that they were very special and fun. Ying Ying's eyes began to shine with joy and she couldn't help but smile. They started chatting among themselves. Gu Pei felt somewhat confused since he didn't know what to say to Patriarch Peng. They arrived at the venomous creature garden. Ying Ying's attention was fixed on a turtle. Soryong opened one of the drawers, which contained a striped snake. He turned and asked Gu Pei how the rat breeding was going. Gu Pei mentioned that at that moment, after giving birth only once or twice, there would no longer be a shortage, estimating that in about 2 months the population would probably exceed 1,000. Soryong noticed that the feeding of the tiger-striped water snake had been solved, so he wondered what was then the problem. Ying Ying took out the small turtle that was inside the cage and began playing with it. Gu Pei began to touch his head, explaining that the number of crickets they were raising as food was not increasing at all, and that because of this, some creatures were starving. With a confused gaze, Soryong put his hand under his chin. He wondered if they might be eating them again, like in the incident with the baby rats, since the crickets, no matter how many there were never enough. After thinking about the matter several times, he came to the conclusion that the only way was to find an alternative food source. At that moment, little Ying Ying began to cry, causing Soryong and Gu Pei to panic. He tried to calm her by asking if she was okay. Ying Ying continued crying, revealing that there was a strange smell, leaving Soryong somewhat confused. She began to show her hand, as a strange smell was coming from it. With a surprised expression, Soryong asked Ying Ying if he could see her silk pouch. Soryong opened the silk pouch using chopsticks and his eyes widened in surprise, realizing that it was just as he had thought. She had made the same mistake he did when he was young. He let out a sigh and asked her to look closely because these were not clickies, but something else. Ying Ying stopped crying. Using the chopsticks, Soryong took another bug out of the silk bag, and Gu Pei noticed that it was a flower weevil. The name of this insect was mealworm beetle. Upon reaching adulthood, it emitted a terrible stench when touched due to the substance secreted by its odoriferous glands. It looked similar to a click beetle, which is why this confusion sometimes happened. Showing one finger, Soryong explained that click beetles made a clicking sound with their abdomen, but the mealworm beetle did not, so she should not confuse them next time. With a gaze full of determination, Ying Ying clenched her fists and nodded her head. With a proud smile, Soryong told Ying Ying that, even so, she had done a good job, since her older brother really needed these friends. Gu Pei became somewhat confused, as he did not know why he would need those stinky insects. Showing the silk bag, Soryong's eyes began to shine with determination. He revealed that, from that moment on, they would raise the mealworm beetles that Ying Ying had caught in the venomous creature garden. Although it didn't seem like much, these mealworm beetles were actually the most commonly used food for insects and lizards. Soryong was happy, as it was the perfect moment. If they replaced the crickets with mealworms, the food supply would be sufficient. With a smile, he mentioned that, thanks to Ying Ying, they could take care of the immediate problem. He decided to go to the cricket breeding facility to see what the problem was. With a cheerful look, Gu Pei nodded. They went to the cricket breeding facility. Our boy put his hand under his chin and began observing carefully, noticing that the breeding facility and environment didn't seem to have any problems. He opened the cap of a jar and his eyes widened in confusion upon seeing that the cricket's legs were detached. His eyes filled with fear as he thought cannibalism was occurring. Because of this, the numbers were not increasing, leaving Gu Pei and the other in shock. He was sure he had given enough food to the crickets. Soryong turned toward him and with a serene smile revealed that he himself had experienced this problem when raising them on Hainan Island too, since sometimes these things happened regardless of food. Soryong began to ponder. He didn't know much about crickets either, which was somewhat frustrating. He was spicy Fabre, not just Faber, so unfortunately he did not possess the knowledge for large-scale breeding of ordinary non-poisonous insects. He knew this was a big problem, since they couldn't figure out the cause. At that moment, one of Gu Pei's men approached them, started touching his head and with a nervous smile mentioned that, if it was someone familiar with crickets, he just happened to know the right person. Gu Pei became somewhat curious upon seeing Huang Gion. He extended his hand toward him and explained to Soryong that, besides himself, Huang Gion was the only volunteer in the poison division. Soryong felt somewhat surprised to see that he had volunteered. This seemed trustworthy to him. With a nervous expression, Huang Gion was honest. He admitted that sometimes he went to the cricket fighting arena to pass the time, although he clarified that he didn't do it often, just enough for some drinks. Our boy felt somewhat confused, but Huang Gion explained that it was a game of chance where crickets fought each other and bets were placed. Since the bigger and stronger crickets were traded at high prices, they were usually raised in facilities inside the gambling den. There was a cricket caretaker there. Somewhere, where the light barely reached, someone began to pet a cricket. It was a woman with long hair. She had bandages all over her body and messy hair. Huang Gian had heard that she knew everything about crickets. Night fell and the streets of the Tang clan lit up with red lanterns. Everyone had gone out to have fun. The women had put on makeup and the men were drinking. Not long after, Soryong, Gu Pei, Lady Huaying and Huang Gaon arrived at the place. They headed toward the gambling den in the capital to meet the cricket caretaker that Huang Gaon had told them about. Soryong and Gu Pei wore elegant suits. Our boy had thought they would use the Lightfoot technique, believing that their destination was far away. However, they were advised to dress well and use a carriage since they were heading to a gambling den. While he was distracted, someone informed him that they had already arrived at the gambling den in the capital, causing him to snap out of his trance. In front of them was a man next to two muscular guards. Gu Pei approached, extended his hand and informed the man that Lady Huaying, the direct descendant of the Tang family, and her fiancé Soryong were there, asking him to show them the way. The man's eyes widened in fear upon hearing that it was the direct descendant of the Tang family. He and his men greeted them with respect. The man introduced himself as the owner of the Golden Phoenix gambling house, welcomed them and expressed what a great honor their visit was. Seeing the man's attitude, Soryong couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. With a smile, Huang Gion asked the owner if they could see the fighter crickets. The owner nodded his head, mentioning that on this very day the battle between the cricket generals was being held. He began to guide them and asked them to enter. Passing through curtains, Soryong and the others entered the betting den. Our boy's attention was fixed on several excited warriors standing around a table. A battle between two crickets was about to begin, and one of the men decided to bet all the prize money he had won last time. The crickets began staring at each other and then attacked. While the two creatures were fighting, people started cheering for the fight. Soryong was somewhat surprised to see that this is what a cricket fight looked like. With a smile, Huang Gion asked if it wasn't exciting, explaining that the one who turned its back on the other would lose. One of the crickets gave a strong bite to the other in the abdomen, causing it to start fleeing from the fight. The owner of the winning cricket couldn't help but smile upon noticing that the battle of the cricket generals had ended. Not long after, several men began showing bags full of money. Huang Gion revealed that they also immediately auctioned off the winning cricket general. According to rumors, one could reach a price of about 30 silver taels. Soryong was in shock at seeing so much money. His eyes began to shine with excitement and, with a smile, he decided that he might dedicate himself to selling crickets later on. With a serious look, Lady Huaying called our boy's attention, telling him that he had already seen enough and that it was time to go meet the caretaker. A few minutes later, they began to descend some stairs, and the owner opened the door to the basement of the place. He couldn't believe that they had come to meet the cricket caretaker. He explained indifferently that, although sometimes other guests wanted to see her, there was nothing special about the girl. Her only task was to feed the crickets and clean, since they didn't care who would win. The owner began pointing at the woman with his finger, revealing that she was the caretaker. He added with disdain that the girl was useless, and for this reason he left the care of the crickets to the brat. Finally, he complained about how incredibly gloomy she could be. The woman turned her back on him, and upon noticing this, the owner started shouting, demanding that she get up immediately. Soryong and Huaying were important guests. He couldn't believe that she wasn't even greeting them. With an expression full of fear, she stood up and apologized. Soryong's eyes widened in surprise and confusion. Upon observing closely, he realized that the caretaker was a woman. With eyes shining with fury, she began to stare at them silently. Soryong remained silent, approached her, extended his hand, and with a serene gaze mentioned that they came from the Sichuan Tang family, and that they simply had a question about the care of crickets, asking if they could consult her about something. She nodded her head. Showing one finger, our boy explained that he was raising several crickets in one place, but they kept eating each other. He wanted to know if she knew the reason for this. She began to ponder and then revealed it was because they wanted meat. She thought Soryong had probably only fed them grass. The crickets were omnivores, so it was necessary to give them meat to avoid cannibalism. Soryong's eyes widened in surprise, and then he began to think that this hadn't even occurred to him. Cannibalism was solely due to the lack of protein. The woman's body began to emit a strange aura. Soryong wondered if this was what it meant to be a true expert in crickets and knew he had to recruit her immediately. With a smile, our boy turned toward Lady Huaying and she understood what he had in mind. She took out a bag, extended her hand, and asked the owner if she could buy the woman. The owner was somewhat confused as he didn't understand why they wanted to buy the girl. With an arrogant smile he slapped her on the back, saying they could take her right then. However, the woman approached Lady Huaying, struck her with her hand, making the gold coin fly into the air, leaving Soryong and the others in shock. With a face full of rage, the owner grabbed her by the hair, demanded to know how she dared and if she was aware of who they were. He began to hit the girl, asking her to go with them, but she screamed that she didn't want to do it. Soryong panicked and told the owner to stop. With a sincere expression, Lady Huaying promised her that they would treat her kindly, and would even take her family to the Tang family if she wished. Even so, she refused again, saying that she did not want to go with them. The owner became even more furious and questioned whether he would have to get violent with her again. Gupai began observing in silence, without saying a single word. Soryong asked the owner to calm down and then with a curious expression asked if she had debts or if she was working in someone else's place. The owner said not exactly, then revealed that about 5 years ago, she had offered to work for him for free and he had taken her in. However, she wasn't good at attending customers, so he simply assigned her minor tasks, saying that she was just another mouth to feed. Our boy let out a sigh since he didn't know why she didn't want to leave with them. Gupai put his hand under his chin and started thinking. Then, he revealed that the girl reminded him of himself before he came under the protection of the Tang family. Soryong's eyes filled with confusion and surprise. Gupai asked the owner if they could take her with them for just one day, explaining that they would feed her and try to persuade her. The owner couldn't help but smile and gave them permission to do whatever they wanted. With a kind expression, Gupai asked the girl what she thought about going out to get some fresh air with them. She began looking down at the ground and then nodded her head. Noticing this, Gupai promised to come back for her the next day. Soryong let out a sigh of relief and Lady Huaying began to show a smile. A while later, they took the woman to the Tang family guest residence within the capital and offered her food. Soryong was somewhat surprised since he didn't know that the Tang family had a building in the capital. Gupai mentioned that this place was like the branch of the Sichuan Tang family in the capital. The 2 inns, 8 pharmacies and 5 restaurants in this alley all belonged to the Tang family. He added that later he would show him the trading company and escort agency. A trading company was an organization made up of merchants, while an escort agency was a business dedicated to delivering goods for a fee. Soryong's jaw dropped in shock upon learning that the entire alley belonged to the Tang family. His grandfather and father-in-law only practiced martial arts all day, so he had always wondered how the family managed to survive. Certainly, he did not expect this. With a curious expression, Gupai asked the woman if she could now tell them why she didn't want to leave, assuring her that if she was in trouble, they could help her. Soryong began to whisper and told Lady Huaying that the woman still hadn't said a word. Lady Huaying mentioned that she also wasn't touching the food or the tea. Gupai noticed that she seemed to be holding some kind of grudge against someone. He told her not to worry and to tell them about it, reminding her that this was the Sichuan Tang family. The woman placed her hands on top of the table and stood up, then she bowed before our boy, leaving him in shock. She introduced herself as Song Nauk from Song Village, a place not very far away. Lady Huaying was in shock to see that the woman had finally spoken. With a calm look, our boy questioned if there was any reason why she didn't want to leave the gambling house. The woman began to stand up and then brushed aside the hair that covered her face, causing Soryong's and the others' eyes to widen in surprise. The woman had a pretty face, but also burn marks. Soryong couldn't help going into shock, while on his side Gupai wondered how someone could have burned a woman's face like that. She decided to tell the truth, declaring that she had to take revenge no matter what it cost. She clenched her teeth tightly and while tears of sadness and rage were emerging from her eyes, she made it clear that she would not leave that place under any circumstances until her grudge was resolved. Song Naik decided to tell her past. Her story dated back to a quiet day in the areas near the Sichuan Song village, where she and her younger sister, Nyeon, lived in the small town where the Song family gathered. After losing their parents at a young age, Song Nauk took it upon herself to raise her younger sister, and because of this, they both became quite well known in the village, due to their beautiful appearance, and especially their pearl-white skin. They were known as the Jade Sisters. Nyeon, in a sad tone, asked her older sister if she couldn't skip work that day. With a smile, Nak explained that the neighboring village wasn't far. She promised she would help with the festival work and return immediately, asking her to wait a little. Nayeon started shouting, saying she didn't want to be alone that day and would rather go with her. The truth was, that day was Nayeon's birthday. Stroking little Nayeon's head, Naek apologized. She couldn't let her suffer too. This was something she had already promised their parents. On the ground was a jar with several crickets, and Nayeok knew that even if her sister felt lonely, she should stay and play with them until she returned. Nayeon calmed down a bit, but still with tears in her eyes, she mentioned that even cricket fights were more fun with two people. Naek reached into her bag and let out a sigh. Noticing this, Nayeon became somewhat curious. Naek took out an incense pouch, which she had been hiding as a birthday gift. She reminded her sister that this was what she had wanted last time. The incense pouch was a small bag filled with aromatic herbs for perfume. Little Nayeon was in shock. Since she recognized it as an incense pouch, she knew it must be very expensive. Naok explained that she had gotten it as a reward for helping out the previous time. She was giving it to her in advance, asking her to please wait patiently that day. Nayeon grabbed the incense pouch and thanked her older sister, promising to treasure it. Now that Nayeon had calmed down, Naek decided to leave. With her eyes shining with joy, Nayeon began to say goodbye to her sister, asking her to come back as soon as possible and assuring her that she would be waiting. Seeing how happy her sister was, Naek couldn't help but feel joyful. However, more guests arrived than expected, so things took longer, and the promised time quickly passed. Once night fell, the workers lit lanterns and warned Naek to be careful, as it was dark and she could get hurt. She asked them to excuse her. Nayeon must be hungry, so she needed to hurry. As she wanted to celebrate her sister's birthday with the delicious festival food, she rushed off without a lantern. In the middle of the night, there was a man in her village. The man turned a corner and the heedless Naek bumped into him. She apologized, and the man advised her to watch where she was going. At that moment, her eyes widened in surprise. The man turned his back and started running, leaving a trail of scent behind him. Naek's attention was fixed on him. As she could smell the incense pouch coming from this man, she felt a little worried. It seemed strange, as outsiders were not often seen in the village, but she simply dismissed it and headed home. A few minutes later, she arrived at her house, announcing her arrival. She was confused, not knowing why everything was so quiet, wondering if her sister had gotten tired of waiting and fallen asleep. She lit a small candle and opened the door. The only thing she could see was the destroyed furniture of the house, her sister lying on the floor with her clothes torn and covered in blood. Naek dropped the candle to the floor and, with tears in her eyes, rushed to see if her little sister was okay. Her eyes filled with fear and sadness as she wondered what the hell had happened. This simply couldn't be happening. The candle set the house on fire. Noticing this, one of the men started pointing at the house and shouting about the fire, recognizing it as Naek's house. Not long after, someone emerged from the burning house. It was Naek, carrying her little sister in her arms. She began to pant heavily, and just before she could reveal what had happened, she lost consciousness and fell to the ground. The others panicked, shouting for someone to call the physician. Naek's eyes were filled with sadness, and the only thing she could see was her house in flames. Back in the present, Soryong finally realized why she had that scar on her face. With a sincere expression, Naek revealed that when she regained consciousness, more than 2 weeks had already passed. An elderly couple was taking care of her. Naek's body was covered in bandages, and she still had burns all over her body. The old man began to cry, explaining that he had asked the escort agency to find that bastard, but they couldn't, and that it wouldn't be easy. The old woman apologized, admitting she didn't know how she could face Hyungnam after this. The only thing Naek could do was cry in silence. Just as all life grows dormant in late autumn, her heart also slowly faded away. The only communication she had with the world were the small whimpers she made when they changed the cloths to treat her burn wounds. Time flowed like a river, and when winter passed and spring arrived, the crickets awoke again. The image of her little sister in the burning house came to her mind. Her little sister asked her big sis to please catch that bastard and relieve her grudge. In the middle of the night, Naek woke up and her eyes widened in fear. She went out into the garden and sat down. It was when the chirping of the crickets sounded like Nayeon's voice that she regained her senses. Naek clenched her fist tightly, and her eyes began to shine with rage. She knew she had to find and kill that bastard. All that remained was a grudge deeply rooted in her bones. The next day, she told the old man something, causing him to panic. With a confused expression, he questioned where she was going, reminding her that she wasn't even fully healed yet. Naek was sincere and revealed that every night, Nayeon screamed in pain. She couldn't stand still. As her sister, she had to avenge her. The old man felt even more confused, questioning how a woman like her could carry out revenge, especially when she didn't even know who that bastard was. The old woman admitted that her husband was right and advised Nyack to take better care of herself. The old man and woman even locked the door so she couldn't leave, but every night the sound of the crickets strengthened her determination even more. In the end, she secretly escaped during the night and left the village. With a sad gaze, she asked them to stay healthy. Nock's attention was fixed on the pouch. She gripped the pouch tightly and asked her sister Nayan to wait just a little longer. The first place she went was the city because the bastard had headed in that direction. She didn't know his face, but just like the red scars left on her body, this unforgettable voice was engraved in her like a brand, and she swore to find him no matter what. She dedicated herself to talking to random men. Of course, no one looked at her kindly. Time began to pass, and 2 years later, on a rainy night, she arrived at the Golden Phoenix gambling house, right during the season when the crickets sang again. Her body shivering from the cold, she asked the owner if she could take shelter from the rain for a moment. The owner was somewhat furious. He called her a brat, yelling that she was ruining his business and to get lost. At that moment, a man walked past her and seemed annoyed by the smell she gave off. Hearing this, Nyack's eyes widened in surprise. With a piercing gaze, the man mentioned that this smell was ruining his mood and told her to get lost. Nyack was in shock, and memories of her little sister lying in the house came to her mind. She hadn't forgotten. She couldn't forget. She had finally found the owner of that voice. Soryong and Hwaying became somewhat curious as they wanted to know what happened next. Nock mentioned that while wandering the city, she approached a beggar who told her that the bastard frequently visited a gambling house. Soryong finally understood why she had worked at the gambling house. With a sad gaze, she explained that she initially thought of following him secretly and stabbing him. However, the beggar told her he was a martial artist, so it was impossible for a woman like her to get revenge on him. The beggar told her that the best way was to poison the alcohol or food he consumed, so she put poison in the drinks she offered him. But even that failed. Apparently, the poison she bought in an alley wasn't really poisonous. After this, she started taking care of the crickets in the basement. Every time she heard their chirping, she remembered Naeun's face. Then, she would be half insane, only to regain her senses again and again. Naek gritted her teeth tightly, and her eyes filled with tears. With a gaze full of anger and rage, she swore that she must kill that bastard and that she could not leave that place until she did. With a confused expression, Soryong began to whisper, explaining to Gupai and Lady Hwaying that, although her circumstances were clear, he was doubtful of the situation. She needed to raise the crickets, but hearing their chirping made her faint. Her mind seemed deeply disturbed. Lady Hwaying was honest. She explained that this only showed the depth of Naek's resentment, and that once she got her revenge, she would heal. She reasoned that if they helped someone with such a deep grudge, she would never betray them, also becoming a good member for their Tang clan. Gupai admitted that Lady Hwaying was right. He explained to Soryong that before he could avenge his own parents, he used to talk to himself in the rain. But after the Tang family carried out the revenge for him, it was as if everything had been purified. Gupai's attention fixed on her. Now he understood why he had seen himself reflected in this woman. Soryong began to ponder, and he started to watch Gupai. Gupai nodded his head. With a confident smile, our boy stood up and got Naok's attention, making her somewhat curious. He placed his hand over his chest and assured Naok that they would help her settle that grudge, asking if, once they did, she could promise to become part of their clan. Naek's eyes widened in surprise. She asked if they could really help her, swearing that if they did, she would serve them with her life until her last breath. Our boy asked her not to worry and to simply entrust it to them. Soryong began to gaze towards the floor, and as his eyes were shining, he asked who exactly that bastard was. Naek felt somewhat surprised. She grew nervous and began to hesitate, unsure whether to tell the truth. After mulling it over, she was filled with determination, clenched her fist, and revealed that the bastard was the third son of the Great Harmony Gate, named Jin Daisung. With a confident smile, Soryong placed a hand on his chest. He would take care of Jin Daisung and destroy him completely. Lady Hwaying's and Gupai's eyes widened in surprise and confusion. Hwaying panicked and asked Naek if she was sure the killer was the third son of the Great Harmony Gate. Naek nodded, promising she was telling the truth. Soryong grew a bit confused and asked if there was a problem. Gupai's attention turned to our boy, and he revealed that the Great Harmony Gate was a sect that belonged to the same orthodox faction as them. In Sichuan, they were the most powerful after the Tang, Aimei, and Qingcheng. Soryong was in shock, not knowing it was such a powerful sect. Lady Huaying placed a hand under her chin and began to ponder. According to her, if what Jin Daisheng had done was true, then his sect didn't matter. She began to whisper, revealing that the problem was the pact their clan had made with the Great Harmony Gate. Her great-grandfather had once received great help from them. Because of this, even if the Great Harmony Gate committed a grave offense or a crime worthy of death, they had to, at least once, unconditionally yield or forgive it. Soryong's eyes widened in fear, realizing this meant he could do whatever he wanted. Lady Huaying mentioned that in the Murim, oaths and promises were extremely important, especially when made in the name of a technique, a clan, or a nickname. They were sacred and had to be fulfilled. Nayak approached them and asked if there was a problem. Hearing her voice, Soryong panicked and with a forced smile, assured her there was no problem. He was just surprised it was someone like that. He told her they would take care of the rest, asking her not to worry and to get some rest. Nayak's eyes filled with tears and gratitude. She didn't know how to express her gratefulness, as she could finally avenge Nayun. Not long after, she collapsed to the ground and fell asleep. Lady Huaying noted that she seemed to have relaxed too suddenly, and proposed that, first, they should take Miss Nayak to the Tang residence to rest. Gu Pei crossed his arms. He knew this would be more complicated than expected. Soryong nodded. He knew he would first have to talk to his grandfather and his father-in-law, and he was sure that, even if it was about an oath, they would understand. The next day, once the sun rose, Soryong and Huaying went to the Tang clan's patriarch's hall. Everyone remained silent, creating tension. With a serious expression, the Grand Patriarch made it clear that the Great Harmony Gate was a prestigious sect in Sichuan and its leader a righteous man, but from a tiger father, a dog son had been born. The Patriarch clasped his hands. He was somewhat confused and surprised, as he couldn't believe Soryong wanted to avenge a woman even knowing about the oath they had with the Great Harmony Gate. Soryong was sincere and asked his father-in-law to grant him permission. The Patriarch began to ponder. Although the circumstances were understandable, the oath of his ancestors was tied to the honor of the Tang clan. He reasoned that if they started making exceptions just because of circumstances, people could no longer make oaths with the Tang clan or trust them. The Grand Patriarch simply nodded in agreement. The Patriarch stood up and forbade the Tang clan's lineage or its poison from helping the woman. Soryong's eyes widened in surprise. He stood up and begged his father-in-law to reconsider. The Patriarch stood firm in his decision, declaring that he had nothing more to say on the matter. Just as Soryong was about to insist further, Lady Huaying grabbed his hand, winked at him, and told her father that she understood and they would do as he commanded. Our boy couldn't help but feel a bit confused. Lady Huaying started to show a smile. She had found the loophole in the order. It was forbidden for the Tang clan's lineage or its poison to help the woman. This meant that, so there would be no suspicion of the clan's involvement, their poison would not be used, and Soryong would be allowed to act on his own. She revealed that Soryong was not of the Tang clan's bloodline. The Patriarch turned his back to them and with a smile, questioned why they were still here. Our boy was somewhat surprised, realizing this was what the Patriarch had meant all along. Huaying suggested they leave quickly, as there was much to do if they were going to help Nayak. Soryong clenched his fists, knowing they had permission and that this was the moment to prove his worth as the son-in-law of the Tang clan. He began to imagine himself capturing Jin Daisheng, reasoning that the initiation ceremony into an organization always involved eliminating someone. The next day, early in the morning, Gu Pei, who was holding a scroll, met with Soryong. He let him know that, although they had received permission, they had to avoid involving the clan's name at all costs, so he would discreetly investigate Jin Daisheng's movements. Soryong asked Gu Pei to take care of it. The first step was to confirm Jin Daisheng's whereabouts and movements. Squad leader Gu Pei, who was a member of the poisonous extermination squad, decided to gather the information. With a smile, our boy went to Nayak's room. Upon opening the door, he saw Lady Huaying and Nayak drinking tea. Soryong greeted them and then asked Nayak if she had rested well. Nayak, who was wearing the Tang clan's attire and had her hair tied up, nodded and thanked him for his help. Soryong couldn't help but smile and feel joyful. Miss Nok had decided to stay at the Tang residence for a while. They had bathed her, changed her clothes, and even fixed her hair, and now her face looked much better. Soryong took out a bag and mentioned that he had brought medicine for the burns from the Tang clan. Nok thanked him again, admitting that she didn't know how she could repay this debt. Soryong sat down and, with an expression full of curiosity, asked if he could ask her about the crickets. Nok nodded. As Soryong's eyes were shining with joy, he began to raise a finger and was about to ask his question. But just at that moment, Gu Pei, who was panting heavily, opened the door to the room. Soryong's attention fixed on him, and he asked squad leader Gu Pei if he had already returned from confirming the information. Gupai got nervous and revealed that he had met a guest on the way. Behind Gupai stood a man with long hair and a long beard, wearing a hat. The man's attention was fixed on them. With a smile, he took off his hat and recognized Lady Huaying, greeting her as the poisonous flower and commenting on how long it had been since he'd last seen her. Lady Huaying stood up, introducing herself as Tang Huayan of the Sichuan Tang clan, and greeted the elder beggar emperor. Soryong felt somewhat confused, not knowing who this guy was, so Lady Huaying asked him to be respectful, explaining that he was the elder beggar emperor, one of the 3 emperors, just like the elder fist emperor. Hearing this, Soryong's eyes widened in fear and surprise, realizing that this was one of the 3 emperors, just like the leader of the Murim alliance. Soryong immediately greeted the beggar emperor, introducing himself as Wei Soryong. The beggar emperor had heard that the fist emperor taught him his martial arts, so he had come to see who he was. Naek's eyes filled with surprise as she recognized the beggar emperor. Lady Huaying questioned if she knew him, and Naek explained that he was the beggar grandfather who had helped her in Chengdu. She added that she didn't know he was such an important person and apologized for her lack of respect. The beggar emperor told her not to worry, as he was now just an old man in the shadows. Huaying became somewhat curious and asked the beggar emperor what brought him to the Tang clan and if perhaps he had come about the matter of the Great Harmony Gate. The beggar emperor couldn't help but laugh, admitting that, as expected of the poisonous flower, she was very astute. Lady Huaying panicked, thinking he had come to stop Naek. The beggar emperor placed his hand under his chin and questioned how he could stop her after knowing the girl's situation. He clarified that since there was no clear proof, he couldn't intervene directly, but he had come to help a little. Soryong approached and asked him how he could help without intervening directly. The beggar emperor began to ponder. With a smile, he revealed that he would help with information, as he was curious to see how the fist emperor's successor would resolve this. He had his young ones investigate the events from a few years ago. Jin Daisheng was a truly problematic guy, the worst of villains, who violated women and didn't hesitate to murder. It was only because of his sect's influence that he hadn't been caught. The emperor suspected about 5 cases in total, including 2 in Chengdu and in the slums outside the city. Apparently, even the Great Harmony Gate considered him a problem. Soryong felt even more furious, realizing this was much worse than he thought. Stroking his beard, the beggar emperor mentioned that since the Song Village incident, Jin Daisheng had kept a low profile. He hadn't gone out, except for his visits to the gambling house every 3 days, and that's why he had advised Naek to use poison. Soryong coughed. He figured the only way to deal with him would be at the gambling house, and he wondered if he should try poisoning him, just like Miss Naek did. Lady Huaying made it clear that Soryong couldn't use the Tang clan's poison. Our boy approached Naek and, with a curious expression, asked her how she was able to distinguish that bastard's food or drink among so many people. With a sincere look, Naek revealed that every time he came, he made very specific and demanding requests, so this information always reached the kitchen. Soryong was a bit confused, but she revealed that whenever food with ingredients like crab or shrimp was served, he would ask for them to be removed from his portion. That's why she poisoned that food, although it wasn't real poison. The beggar emperor remembered that the guy had said something broke out on his body just from tasting it. Connecting the dots, Soryong realized that Guy had an allergy to crustaceans, and a very severe one at that. Our boy started thinking about crab, shrimp, and the protein they contained, tropomyosin. Several seconds later, with a confident smile, he got squad leader Gupei's attention and asked him to go immediately to the poison storage to bring him yellow worm powder. Gupei was confused, not understanding why he was suddenly asking for yellow worm powder. Soryong started to laugh wickedly, and everyone's attention fixed on him, not knowing what he had in mind. Holding up a finger and smiling, Soryong revealed that he was going to kill that guy in a brilliant way. Crossing his arms, Soryong began to imagine a worm and decided to call this operation Savory Death. He realized that the root cause of Jin Daisheng's shellfish allergy was precisely tropomyosin, a protein component that constitutes muscle. Tropomyosin was present in most animals, but unlike the version in vertebrates, which was 90% similar to the human one, the invertebrate version had a much lower similarity, and this was what caused the allergy. The important thing was that tropomyosin was found in great abundance in mealworms, even in a much higher quantity than in crustaceans like shrimp or crabs. While our boy was distracted, Gupei opened the door with a bag in hand, informing him that he had brought the mealworms as requested. Soryong got to work and started cooking while Lady Huaying and Gupei watched in silence. He took out the mealworms, boiled them in hot water, and then lightly stir-fried them in a hot wok. Soryong prepared a delicious dish and placed it on the table. With a smile, he asked everyone to try this stir-fried mealworm. Naek, the beggar emperor, and Lady Huaying began to stare at the dish with expressions full of contempt, wondering in horror if he was really asking them to eat this. Soryong nodded, promising it was very tasty and delicious. They decided to trust Soryong, and the first person to try Soryong's dish was the beggar emperor. Lady Huaying and Naok remained silent, not knowing what to do. Without wasting any more time, Lady Huaying grabbed a mealworm and put it in her mouth. The taste left them impressed. Both she and the beggar emperor were in shock. It was delicious. They couldn't understand how an insect could be so tasty. Noticing this, Soryong's eyes began to shine with joy. Of course, it was delicious, so much so that it was known as gosoe for being a savory larva. In his past life, it had been a surprisingly popular snack. With a curious expression, the beggar emperor admitted it was tasty but asked how he planned to assassinate Jin Daeshung with this. Our boy crossed his arms, then, showing a finger and a confident smile, he reminded them how it was mentioned that Jin Daeshung had a reaction when eating things like crab and shrimp. He explained that what was harmless to one person could be a poison to another. Just like crab or shrimp, these mealworms also contained an ingredient that was a poison to him. Lady Huaying realized it was similar to how Lady Yongyong was sensitive to bee venom. Soryong explained that if they ground it finely and mixed it with other food, it would only add a delicious flavor, and there would be no reason to suspect murder by poisoning. With a smile, the beggar emperor began to stroke his beard, realizing that this was what Soryong meant by killing him in a savory way. Soryong began to ponder and mentioned that the more they added, the more certain the effect would be, so they would add a generous amount. The problem was deciding which food to put this in. Nok raised her hand and in a calm tone, mentioned that she had a good idea. Soryong became curious, wondering what she had in mind. She extended her hand and proposed putting the mealworms in ryatagan, as they often ate it at the gambling house. Hearing this, Soryong felt a bit confused. In a serious tone, she explained that ryatagan was made of glutinous rice with red bean paste inside. Sometimes, its exterior was covered with syrup and then with soybean powder. If they mixed this mealworm powder with the soybean powder and coated it, it would be perfect. An idea came to Soryong's mind, a glutinous rice cake soaked in yellow worm powder, and on top, covered with a sticky syrup. This was the perfect dish to die of asphyxiation. It was perfect for a murder. Clenching her fist tightly, she asked Soryong to let her make the ryatagan. Only if she made it with her own hands would she feel that she had been freed from this grudge. Stroking his beard, the beggar emperor nodded. He agreed that revenge should come from her own hands. His last meal, a ryatagan covered in insect powder, was a fitting end for trash like him. Our boy decided to ask the owner of the gambling house to let her do the cooking for a day. With a worried gaze, Lady Huaying proposed that, just in case, they should participate in the gambling to keep him there and prevent him from escaping. A smile spread across Soryong's face, and his eyes began to glint with malice. This plan was becoming more and more flawless, a plan from which he could not escape alive. A few days later, Jin Daeshung, holding a bag full of coins alongside his bodyguard, headed for the Golden Phoenix gambling house. The owner greeted him respectfully, welcoming him. With an arrogant expression, Jin Daeshung dismissed the greetings and demanded liquor and women at his usual table. Just then, the owner apologized, informing him that the table was already occupied by special guests. Jin Daeshung felt somewhat confused, and when he entered the place, his eyes widened in surprise. At the table where Jin Daeshung usually sat, Soryong and Lady Huaying were gambling. Jin Daeshung's attention was fixed on the beautiful Lady Huaying, whom he recognized as Tang Huaying, the poison flower of the Sichuan Tang clan. Jin Daeshung approached and with a smile, greeted Huaying respectfully, mentioning that he didn't expect to see her in this place. With a confused gaze, Huaying asked who he was. With a nervous expression, Jin Daeshung introduced himself as the third son of the Great Harmony Gate, reminding her that he had visited her some time ago and asking if she didn't remember. Soryong interrupted the chat because he had won a bet. Showing a confident expression, he asked Lady Huaying what she thought of his skills. While Huaying's eyes were shining with admiration, she admitted that Soryong was incredible. Jin Daeshung became confused and asked his bodyguard who Soryong was. His bodyguard replied that he had heard the poison flower had a fiancé and presumed that it was him. Soryong began to smile, and Jin Daeshung panicked. He couldn't believe it. He wondered how that weak-looking wimp could have such a beautiful woman by his side, when even he hadn't managed it. His eyes began to glint with malice. He remembered that woman from the Song clan from a few years ago. According to him, she hadn't been bad at all. His mouth watered at the memory. If she hadn't resisted so much, he wouldn't have ended up killing her by accident. It was a shame her older sister wasn't there, as they said she was even more beautiful. Just then, he approached the table and Soryong's and Hwaying's attention fixed on him. Jin Daisheng sat down across from them, extended his hand, and declaring it was an honor to meet the Poison Flower's fiancé, asked if he would like to have a game with him. Soryong didn't refuse. A smile spread across Jin Daisheng's face. Whatever the case, this was a good opportunity. He was going to crush him completely and ridicule him in front of everyone. A moment later, Jin Daeseung's arrogant and confident expression vanished completely, leaving him in shock. Soryong won yet again, and Lady Hwaying began to cheer him on. Jin Daeseung couldn't help but feel somewhat confused, not knowing what was happening. According to him, this was ridiculous. Soryong grabbed the bag of coins, and all Jin Daisheng could do was stare. He had been losing non-stop for an hour and had already lost half of his money. Soryong grabbed the bags of coins and with a smile, said it was getting late and that he had to go. Soryong and the others left. Furious, Jin Daisheng clenched his teeth and fists tightly, cursing the tremendous humiliation this represented. He let out a sigh and tried to calm down, thinking it was just a bad streak. Then he told the servant to bring him something to eat, as he was a bit hungry after all the tension. His attention was caught by some men who were eating. One of them mentioned that the ryatagan was especially delicious, much better than the ones sold in the market. With a curious gaze, he turned to the servant and asked if it was really that delicious. With a smile, the servant mentioned that it was especially delicious today and asked if the young master would like to try some. The servant brought the dish, and Jin Daisheng decided to try a little. Grabbing a piece, he took a bite. It was really delicious. He noticed that the more he chewed it, the crunchier and more delicious it felt. Not long after, Jin Daisheng's face twisted in pain, causing him to fall from his chair to the ground. He placed his hands on his neck, feeling a familiar sensation. Hearing the commotion, Soryong and the others started running towards him, worried about what had happened. The bodyguard revealed that the young master had collapsed after eating the ryotagan. Soryong asked the bodyguard to step aside for a moment to attend to him. Worried, the bodyguard asked Jin Daisheng to hang on for a bit. Foaming at the mouth and with his eyes full of tears, Jin Daisheng grabbed Soryong by the shirt, begging for help. But not long after, his eyes widened in surprise. As a sinister aura emanated from Soryong's body, he began to stare at Jin Daisheng and asked him if he had enjoyed the ryotagan. With a cold expression, he told him that for the crime he had committed in the Song clan's village, he hoped he would regret it forever, even in the afterlife. Furious, Jin Daesung grabbed Soryong by the collar, not knowing how this bastard knew about that. Soryong pushed Jin Daesung's hand away, exclaiming that he seemed to be suffering horribly. Jin Daesung started screaming in pain, and Soryong mentioned that if the patient struggled too much, he wouldn't be able to channel his internal energy, and asked the others to hold him down. Everyone rushed to help and began to grab Jin Daisheng, who slowly began to suffocate. That delicious taste left in his mouth became his last memory in life. The next day, Soryong and Lady Hwaying met with the elderly couple who had taken care of Naok. The old man bowed his head before them and asked them to take good care of their Naok, as he couldn't imagine how much the little one must have suffered. Soryong assured them that she was now part of the Tang clan, so they shouldn't worry. As the wind blew, Naok began to walk towards a grave in silence. Soryong's attention was fixed on her, leaving him somewhat curious. Before returning to the Tang clan, they had visited the Song clan's village. Luckily, Jin Daisheng's case was resolved without a trace. Normally, there would have been an investigation into possible poisoning, but since he was a son rejected by his own family, it seemed they did their best to keep the matter from going public. Tears began to well up in Naok's eyes. She rested her hands on her sister's grave and couldn't help but cry, wondering if she had taken too long. Overwhelmed by guilt, she lamented not having come home earlier that day, repeating over and over that she was sorry. Soryong couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised, and he realized that even the crickets were crying. Lady Hwaying's eyes widened with sadness. She remembered that Miss Naok had told her that the song of the crickets reminded her of her younger sister's voice. Soryong wondered what her younger sister might be saying to her at that very moment. As the sun was setting and the crickets were crying, the only thing Naok could do was feel guilty for not having gotten home sooner. The sun was setting in the alleys of Sichuan's capital. Not far away, a man in a hat was eating. It was the beggar emperor, who was enjoying the dish prepared by Soryong. He couldn't help but smile, because although it might seem unpleasant, it was truly rich and delicious. To him, Soryong's plan, a savory revenge, confirmed that our boy was a truly interesting guy. Two people were observing the beggar emperor in silence, Noticing this, his expression turned serious. Clenching his fist, he demanded that they come out, declaring that only a thief would lurk in hiding like that. Realizing they had been discovered, they felt somewhat confused. Without wasting any more time, they came out of their hiding spot and descended behind the beggar emperor. The man acknowledged that, as expected, the emperor's perception was still incredibly sharp and asked him what he of all people was doing in this place. The man was one of the 5 emperors, the divine thief Kang Ji-ho, and the girl was his disciple, Cho Yong-ryon. Crossing his arms, Kang Ji-ho felt offended by the term thief. He reproached him, saying that after not seeing each other for so long, this was his way of greeting him. The beggar emperor felt somewhat confused, wondering how else he was supposed to address a thief. With a nervous smile, Kang Ji-ho suggested that divine thief sounded much better. Besides, he reminded him that his disciple was present and asked him to show a little dignity. Yong-ryon greeted the emperor with respect, leaving him somewhat confused. For him, dealing with that bastard alone was already enough of a headache, and the fact that he now had a disciple too only heralded more trouble in the future. With a curious expression, the beggar emperor asked what brought them to Sichuan. With a nervous smile, Kang Ji-ho explained that he had something to ask. He was looking for the person with the greatest knowledge of silkworms in all the Central Plains. Pointing to his wrist, Kang Ji-ho explained that his sacred item, the heavenly silks, had recently broken. He had believed they would last forever, but he guessed that even it had a lifespan. His tradition was to pass on the heavenly silks once the disciple's training was complete, but at this rate, he wouldn't be able to pass anything on to her. The beggar emperor placed a hand under his chin and began to ponder. For this case, he did know a guy. Kang Ji-ho was anxious to know who this guy was. The beggar emperor began to smile, and his eyes shone with confidence. The image of Soryong came to his mind, because in all the Central Plains, he might be the man who knew the most about insects. A few days later, it was dawn in the poison garden. Soryong was screaming in pain. One of Gupai's men was hitting him on the back with a whip, telling him to endure just a little longer. Not far away, Lady Huaying and the small centipedes were observing in silence. Soryong was cultivating the iron coffer art, a unique martial art of the Fist Emperor based on poison. In short, this was a technique that strengthened him the more he was beaten, almost to the point of death. The method consisted of tensing his muscles upon receiving a blow and, at that exact moment, circulating his chi to harden his body. With a cheerful gaze, Lady Huaying and the centipedes began to cheer our boy on. The man gripped the whip tightly, declaring that this was where it truly began. One of the centipedes' attention was fixed on it, and its eyes began to shine with excitement as it remembered when Lady Huaying used to caress them with a feather. Without wasting another second, it leaped from Huaying's arms, causing her eyes to widen in confusion. As the whip was slowly approaching, it jumped and put itself in the path of the lash. Noticing this, Soryong, whose back was covered in wounds, panicked. Luckily, he was quick, and using his arm, he grabbed the small centipede and then took the full force of the lash on his back. Our boy placed the centipede on the ground and began to pant heavily, knowing it had been a close call. Lady Huaying felt somewhat worried for our boy. She scolded the little one, Hyang-ah, for its dangerous action, wondering in exasperation if they couldn't have a single day of peace. Soryong, somewhat surprised, asked if Hyang-ah got into trouble often. Letting out a sigh, Lady Huaying explained that Hyang-ah was such an energetic creature that it simply couldn't stay still. From the moment it opened its eyes, it would start causing trouble. The last time, it had chased a butterfly, and it ended in enormous chaos. Soryong was in shock, as the little one could have been seriously hurt. The centipede sister started to scold Hyang-ah. To Soryong, seeing another centipede scold Hyang-ah was something anyone who had ever raised a pet knew. Even within the same species, each individual had a different personality. Apparently, Hyang-ah was curious and mischievous. Since Cho had recently caused a major incident, Hyang-ah seemed to hold the title of resident troublemaker for now. Cho, being the eldest, was sensible and charismatic. She kept the younger ones in line, being strict when necessary. Finally, there was Bin-ah. She was usually quiet, but deep down, she was a tsundere who held the greatest affection for him. Her only small problem was that she slept a lot. To Soryong, this confirmed that, although they looked similar, the three had their own unique personalities and were special creatures. His wish was for them to grow up healthy and strong so they could become great blue venom sovereigns, just like their mother. Lady Huaying approached the small centipedes, asking them to come to Mama. Soryong couldn't help but smile. While they were distracted, Nyok and Gupai appeared. Gupai greeted Soryong with respect. While Nayak held a jar, Soryong commented that they were both up and working hard, and his eyes expanded in surprise upon noticing that the poison unit's uniform suited Nayak really well. With a nervous smile, Nayak thanked him. With a curious gaze, Soryong asked her how her life in the Tang clan was going. She explained that everyone treated her much better than she deserved and that the work was also manageable. With a cheerful expression, she opened the lid of the jar, announcing that these were the things he had asked for. Soryong approached, and his eyes widened with curiosity. He felt happy to see that the jar was full of crickets. Gupai was honest, admitting that this might be more crickets than they could use and that it was because Nayak handled everything so meticulously. Nayak couldn't help but feel a bit sad, and our boy figured that being too good at your job could also be a problem. With a confident smile, he declared that, in that case, he would make sure to bring new members to the Poison Garden soon. Gupai, somewhat surprised, asked him if he was finally going out to capture new poisonous creatures. Crossing his arms, our boy nodded, explaining that while they could stop raising them, honestly, the best way to use them was as food for other beasts. Lady Huaying, somewhat worried, approached and interrupted them, advising Soryong that, before doing this, they should probably wait for news from the Martial Alliance. Her eyes filled with fear as she explained that to go on an expedition and gather them, they would need an official permit, and with the blood cult situation, it wasn't easy to get permission to go out at the moment. She had heard that the Alliance leader had personally led the raid on the border of the Daiwell nation, but since then, there had been no news. Hearing this, Soryong's and Gupai's eyes began to shine with anger. While they were talking, a servant came running, making them somewhat curious. Huaying asked her what was happening, as she was in such a hurry. The servant informed them that the clan head was calling them to the clan head's hall, as he had something to tell both of them. This left them somewhat confused and surprised. Both went to the clan head's hall, where the patriarch clasped his hands and began to ponder in silence. Soryong's and Lady Huaying's attention was fixed on him. Soryong felt the tension in the air. He wondered what this could be about, as the clan head would normally be busy at this time, and he questioned if something had happened again. His father-in-law's strange smile seemed ominous. The patriarch decided to speak and, laughing, told his son-in-law that he brought the news Soryong wanted to hear. He extended his hands and took out a scroll. With a smile, he began to point at it with his finger and revealed that they had finally received news from the Martial Alliance. The expedition had been a great success. A joyful and surprised smile spread across Soryong's and Huaying's faces. The patriarch explained that the Alliance leader had raided a village on the Daiwell border and completely annihilated the blood cult's base. Half of those cult bastards were killed or captured, and the rest fled towards Daiwell. Both felt thrilled as they knew what this meant. They started to dance with joy, and the patriarch confirmed that they could finally go capture poisonous creatures as they wished, giving them his permission to form an expedition. With a cheerful gaze, Soryong lamented not having planned their destination in advance. With a serious tone, the patriarch clasped his hands and mentioned that, in this case, he had a place to recommend. Soryong turned around, his eyes filled with curiosity. The patriarch began to stare at Soryong, because for the first expedition of the Tang clan poison division, there was no place more suitable than this, a place where countless poisonous creatures roamed everywhere, where even at the entrance there were beasts on par with those of the Golden Phoenix class, a place known as a paradise for poisonous beasts. This place was Yunnan. Several days passed, and the journey took him to the far southwestern edge of the Central Plains, below Sichuan, to the tropical jungle of Yunnan. Deep in the Ilau Mountains, there was a valley known as the Poison Ravine. This was a place where the cries of beasts were heard before the words of men, a land where strange rocks rose like forests, and mysterious creatures abounded. For him, this was basically paradise on earth. Soryong was lying on his bed next to his pets, the sleeping centipedes and lizards. He was happy, unable to wait to discover what kind of creatures inhabited this place. Grabbing one of the centipedes, Soryong asked them to wait just a little longer, as he was going to bring them back many new friends. Several days went by, and soon in the morning, a small unit was selected from the Poison Division to form the expedition. The management of the Poison Garden was entrusted to Lady Nayak, who was officially appointed vice captain of the division. It was considered that without a title, it would be inconvenient for her to give direct orders while the team was away. Soryong, Gupai, and the others prepared their luggage, and just as they were about to depart from the Tang clan, one of the small centipedes grabbed our boy's foot and began to cry. It wasn't just one, but all of Soryong's pets, the lizards, the centipedes, and even the spider Yowa. With a nervous smile, Soryong asked them to let go so he could leave. They started to growl, not wanting him to go. Soryong then asked them to understand, as he was only leaving to bring them more friends. He assured them they shouldn't worry, since while he was away, the members of the Poison Division would provide them with yang energy. Hearing this, Yohwa's eyes widened in surprise. In the blink of an eye, she wrapped Soryong's body in a spiderweb, causing him to start screaming for her to release him. Lady Huaying noticed that they didn't want to be separated from him. Soryong complained that they kept insisting on going with him. Finally, as Soryong began to break free from the webbing, the Grand Patriarch explained that this wouldn't work. Perhaps the others could go, but Yohwa couldn't, as she had the exact form of Lady Huaying. He knew that her massive spider body would attract attention, and they wouldn't be able to provide an explanation for it. Yohwa began to stare silently at the Grand Patriarch. She decided it was time to do something about it. Everyone's attention was fixed on her, leaving them somewhat confused. Yohwa's body began to change, and not long after, her massive spider body disappeared, leaving only the appearance of Lady Huaying. She sat down and began to show a proud smile. Soryong's and the Grand Patriarch's jaws dropped in shock upon seeing that Yohwa's body had vanished. They couldn't understand how this had happened, and Soryong despaired, wondering where his pet's beautiful body had gone. Soryong approached and began to caress Yohwa's smooth spider skin. Lady Huaying was somewhat confused. The Grand Patriarch was clever and realized that she could hide her body from sight. Our boy was overjoyed, since this way no one would mistake her for a spider demon. With a smile, Lady Huaying let out a sigh and accepted that in this case, everyone could accompany them, offering to help take care of them. Soryong began to smile. Lady Huaying approached them and warned that since they had ignored their father and thrown a tantrum, they would have to obey during the trip. Soryong stepped forward, and with the lizard sitting on his shoulders, he raised his hand and with a smile announced that they were ready to leave, and thus the first journey of the Poison Division began. They arrived in the vicinity of Mount Eme, in the Sichuan province, where there was a long line. With a confused expression, Soryong asked Gupai why the line was so long. Gupai explained that it was a checkpoint. Since the appearance of the blood cult, these inspections were sometimes carried out in the middle of the road. He had heard it wasn't easy to pass and expressed his concern about whether they would be all right. The attention of one of the workers was drawn to them upon recognizing the Honorable Elder Mandong Shingun. She noticed that even members of the Tang clan were there. With a kind smile, the Grand Patriarch informed her that they were heading to Yunnan, and asked for permission to pass. The woman began to smile and replied that, of course, they could proceed. Soryong let out a sigh of relief. It was a completely free pass. The influence of the Tang clan was truly strong, for no matter where they went, they were treated with great respect. Just then, the woman's eyes began to shine with surprise and confusion, asking them to stop for a moment. She noticed that Yohwa was floating in the air. Soryong's eyes filled with fear, making him panic as he realized that her body was invisible, which was why it only looked like Yohwa was floating. To everyone's surprise, the woman was amazed, as she believed this was the sky-leaping void technique. She was convinced that the young lady had mastered a divine skill and wondered when she could have trained in such an art. Everyone was astonished, thinking it was incredible and just what one would expect from one of the three flowers of the martial world. The only thing Yohwa could do was show a grateful smile. At that moment, with a furious gaze, Lady Huaying grabbed Yohwa by the clothes, and Soryong and the others started running while shouting for them to forgive them, as the young lady was just shy. Everyone was somewhat confused and in shock, not knowing what was happening. As they fled the scene, Lady Huaying asked Soryong to do something about Yohwa, as people would get the wrong idea. He, in turn, begged her to calm down. To avoid suspicion because of Yohwa, Huaying dressed in men's clothes and covered her face with a veil during the journey. In the Central Plains, twins were considered as ominous as demons due to superstition. Although a few small incidents like this occurred on the way, in the end, they arrived in Yunnan safely. Soryong and the others were exhausted. In front of them was a beautiful river and mountains. They were happy, as this was Ilao Mountain. The Grand Patriarch mentioned that there was only a little further to go to reach the Poison Ravine. With a worried expression, Soryong turned around and put his hand under his chin, as he felt that something wasn't right. Gupai grew curious and asked him what he meant. Soryong mentioned that it was strangely quiet around here. He began to observe carefully. There were no signs of life, neither in the cracks of the caves nor in the trees. He couldn't perceive any sign of life at all. The Grand Patriarch felt somewhat confused. With a serious gaze, he acknowledged that this feeling was not unknown to him. It was just like when they had hunted the blue venom sovereign. Soryong's eyes widened in surprise when the Grand Patriarch mentioned the blue venom sovereign. The Grand Patriarch nodded, confirming it and explaining that around the sovereign's lair, even the chirping of insects had disappeared. Everything had either fled or become prey. He decided to explore a bit. He instructed the rest to fall back to the point where the Yun River and the Amok River joined, as birds still seemed to be flying there. Soryong and the others showed no objection. The Grand Patriarch gathered his strength and leaped away. Observing carefully, Lady Huaying confirmed that he was right. On the side they had crossed, birds and insects were still present. Gupai felt that something was dividing the area along the river. Soryong was lost in his thoughts, concluding that something must be living there, in Ailao Mountain. But to claim such a vast territory, it had to be something dangerous. Crossing his arms, he let out a sigh, knowing this was strange. With a curious look, Lady Huaying asked him what he meant. Soryong turned and explained that for a beast to take such a wide area as its lair, it would have to be enormous, like the blue venom sovereign. Soryong was unsure, as he saw no signs either beyond the river or along the path deep into Ailao. He wondered how it would hunt or find prey if there was nothing there. He closed his eyes, certain that its suspected size was too large and the environment wasn't suitable to sustain prey. This was truly strange. Gupai coughed, acknowledging that this was true. They hoped the Grand Patriarch would discover something. A while later, the Grand Patriarch and his men returned. Noticing this, Soryong's attention fixed on them, making him curious. The Grand Patriarch revealed that this was problematic, as even at the entrance of Ailao Mountain he had found nothing, leaving Soryong and the others in shock. With a confident smile, the Grand Patriarch stated that the poison ravine was most likely the same. He added that the sun was almost setting, so they should stop there for the day and search again tomorrow. Soryong thought the Grand Patriarch was right, although deep down he was furious. They couldn't return empty-handed. They would capture whatever it was, no matter the cost. Night fell and they lit a bonfire to prepare food. While Soryong was playing with the centipedes, Lady Huaying brought him a plate of food. She asked Soryong to eat and then told the pets to let their father rest and go with her. Soryong thanked her. She noticed Soryong was examining the map and with a smile asked what he was doing. Soryong was checking the vast expanse of the area. He believed the creature's lair was likely in the center. While they were talking, one of the centipedes' attention was caught by a dragonfly flying near them. Without hesitating for a second, it jumped and attacked it fiercely. Noticing this, Soryong and Lady Huaying were shocked, not knowing what was happening. Soryong scolded Hyanga, saying that it had scared him and shouldn't jump like that. Lady Huaying noticed it was trying to catch that dragonfly in midair. Soryong thought it must be because they were near the river, with many dragonflies around. However, just before, there were none. His eyes widened in surprise and his attention fixed on the dragonflies flying behind him. Without wasting any more time, Soryong told the Grand Patriarch to return to the places they had checked earlier to see how many dragonflies were flying there now. With a confused expression, the Grand Patriarch turned and asked what he meant. Soryong explained that land creatures could remain hidden, but dragonflies could fly wherever they pleased. He revealed that if something threatened them, they would have fled for a while, but once the threat disappeared, they would return. He put his hand under his chin and, with a confident look, concluded that the reason they hadn't seen any creatures wasn't because it was its territory. Somewhere else in the forest, there were skulls and remains of devoured animals. This was because, before they arrived, something had already swept through this land.